Hey guys, I'm back. Matt let me out of the benchmarking lab this week to help him out with the 1050 launch, and I'm pretty excited to see what Nvidia's new entry-level GPUs have to offer us. You may have noticed what I have here isn't the 1050, but rather MSI's Gaming Z graphics card. It's the 1080 model, and very, very powerful, very efficient graphics card. A lot of gamers would love to have one of these in their rig, but not everyone does because they cost several hundred US. And even if you can afford one, not everyone's going to justify spending that kind of money just to play games. I mean, that is a lot of money. So that's why both AMD and Nvidia have the entry-level guys. Currently, at the moment, probably the best entry-level card is AMD's RX 460. At 110 for the 2GB model, it's extremely good value. It's better than the 950 or the 750 Ti from last generation. They're both still great graphics cards, but the newer RX 460 just has a bit more to offer at the price. And today, Nvidia will be finally taking it to AMD with their Pascal 1050 Ti, so let's take a look at it. It's a nice little, very little card. It's the first thing that jumps out at you is actually how tiny the graphics card is. And I'll just get that out of the way. Actually, one of the reasons why I have this thing on hand is to show you just how small the 1050 Ti really is. I mean, if that gives you some idea, there are the two cards side by side. This little fella, it is 177 millimeters long, total length that is. The PCB is just 150 millimeters long. So a compact card overall. It's also very, very light, which probably won't surprise many of you. Before we jump to the benchmarks, where we check out, game performance, thermals, power consumption, all that good stuff, be sure to check out Matt's review on the vanilla card here. Or rather, it's probably more up here. Better get that. And once you've checked that out, come back and we'll get on with this thing. Alright. Now that we've taken a quick look at MSI's GTX 1050 Ti, let's rip off that cooler to get a better look at the PCB. And while we're at it, we might even take a peek at that cheeky little heatsink. The entire card weighs just 329 grams, which is almost 3 times less than most mid-range to high-end graphics cards. Including the fan, plastic shroud, and tiny aluminium heatsink, the cooler totals 193 grams. The heatsink measures just 95mm long, 90mm tall, and 18mm thick. It also tips the scales at just 118 grams. I've seen tablets with bigger heatsinks. Like the standard 1050, the Ti model doesn't require an external 6-pin PCI Express connector, and MSI hasn't felt the need to include one, which I quite like. They have also stuck with a basic 3+1 power phase design, though this should be more than enough to keep the 75W TDP card happy. Unlike the standard 1050, the Ti model uses the full GP107 silicon, and this means 12 working SM units, allowing it to pack 20% more CUDA cores for a grand total of 768. There are also 48 TMUs and 32 ROPs. Nvidia has set the default clock specifications at 1290 MHz for the base clock and 1392 MHz for the boost clock. MSI has beefed up these frequencies a tad by pushing the base to 1341 MHz, resulting in a boost frequency of 1455 MHz. This is a 5% overclock, so we aren't expecting any huge improvements here. All 1050 Ti cards will come fitted with 4GB of GDDR5 memory, clocked at 1750 MHz, and MSI hasn't tinkered with the operating frequency here. Armed with what seems like a rather inadequate 128-bit wide memory bus, the 1050 Ti grabs data from the memory at a rate of 112GB per second. This is the same memory bandwidth available to the RX 460, which also boasts a 128-bit wide memory bus. Getting back to the MSI card, we find at the I/O end there's a DisplayPort 1.4, HDMI 2.0, and dual-link DVI port. These outputs should have most users well covered, and all three can be used simultaneously if need be. Alright, so at this point we've pretty much covered all the important stuff. Before jumping into the benchmarks, a few quick notes on the testing. Many of you have requested that we use our Skylake Core i3 test machine for this review, rather than the beefy Core i7 rig. This is something we've done in the past for sub $200 graphics card reviews, and again we feel it makes the most sense here. The latest AMD and Nvidia drivers were used for testing, and while the results for other cards such as the RX 460 have been carried over from previous tests, we did did go through the results with updated drivers and made changes where need be. For the most part though, things stayed much the same. Okay, finally, the moment you guys have all been waiting for, the benchmarks. Let's get to it. Where else would we start but Battlefield 1? Yes, we did test using DirectX 11, but no, we aren't trying to make Nvidia look good here, so please put those pitchforks down. In our opinion, the DirectX 12 implementation is a little too buggy at the moment, and both AMD and Nvidia GPUs suffer from regular dips in performance. So this is why we're sticking with DirectX 11 for now. The game is extremely well optimized using DirectX 11 and runs like a treat in hardware from both teams. The GTX 1050 managed to edge out the 950, which isn't bad, but we did see much more impressive performance from the TI model. The 18% boost in performance took the average frame rate from 49 frames per second to 58 frames per second. This meant the 1050 Ti was 5% faster than 960 and not a great deal slower than the R9 380. Quite an impressive result then. For those of you who simply couldn't forgive us for testing Battlefield 1 using the DirectX 11 API, maybe you can forgive us because we've included Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Here the 1050 Ti was 15% faster than the vanilla 1050, but more importantly matched the RX 460 4GB card. Even with the medium quality settings enabled, performance here wasn't exactly stellar, and a massive step forward can be seen when moving to the R9 380. Doom with VULKAN. Yep, we're trying to keep everyone happy here. Doom really loathes 2GB graphics cards, and for that reason, the standard 1050 struggles a little with the minimums. That said, we are gaming at 1080p with the game virtually maxed out, so a 47 FPS minimum is still very acceptable. Still, this makes the 1050 Ti's 73 FPS minimum even more impressive, and despite using VULKAN, it was still able to best the RX 460 4GB card, so a big win for Nvidia here. In Gears of War 4, the 1050 Ti might have only been 11% faster on average when compared to the base model 1050, but that was enough of a boost to reach 60 FPS on average. It also meant that the Ti was 25% faster than the RX 460. That said, it was still 7% slower than the GTX 960 and 12% slower than the R9 380. Even I was wondering why we bothered testing Mafia 3. Really, the only reason we include this game, because, well, let's be honest, the optimization is shocking, is the fact that it is a newly released title, and it is quite a bit of fun to play. Using the low preset, I know right, low, freaking hell, we averaged just 43 frames per second with the 1050 Ti. This placed it on par with the R9 380X, and as such meant that it was 30% faster than the RX 460. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is a great quality game, and here the 1050 Ti was 12% faster than the standard 1050. Rendering 66 FPS on average also meant the Ti was 32% faster than the RX 460 and just 4% slower than the R9 380. Interestingly, it was also 6% faster than the GTX 960. I realise these new GPUs aren't going to have any issues with Overwatch. That said, as a super competitive first-person shooter, gamers crave high frame rates in this title, so being able to push well over 60 FPS using the ultra-quality settings at 1080p is a nice luxury. The 1050 Ti certainly delivers here, averaging 113 frames per second and never dipping below 99 FPS. This made it 55% faster than the RX 460 4GB card. Finally, before getting the overclocking, power consumption, and temps, we're going to take a quick look at the frame rate performance in Quantum Break. This is another controversial title that we've tested with, since we're using the Steam version, which limits us to DirectX 11 testing. Here the 1050 Ti averaged 75 frames per second using the medium quality preset, and this was obviously very playable. Shockingly though, this meant that the 1050 Ti was 60% faster than the RX 460. As far as I can tell, this is a bit like the Battlefield 1 situation. The AMD graphics cards deliver much the same performance using DirectX 11 with the Steam version as they do with DirectX 12 in the Windows Store version. Meanwhile, the GeForce cards pretty much suck using DirectX 12, but they're much stronger using Steam's DirectX 11 version. Using MSI Afterburner, we overclocked the core to a base frequency of 1552 MHz, which gave us a boost clock of 1665 MHz. The memory went from 1750 MHz to 1927 MHz. This saw the 1050 Ti operating at between 1860 to 1900 MHz when gaming. As a result, we saw a mild 6% performance gain in Gears of War 4, taking the average frame rate from 60 FPS to 64 FPS. So not an earth-shattering result here, but a free performance bump all the same. Testing with Battlefield 1, we saw a better 8% performance gain from overclock, and that was enough to match the 960, so not a bad result here then. I've been very keen to check out the power consumption figures, and the 1050 Ti doesn't disappoint here. Our entire Core i3 rig consumed just 118 watts when paired with the 1050 Ti. And that's gaming consumption, folks. So basically, you're looking at similar power consumption to the already efficient GTX 750 Ti. The 1050 doesn't make the RX 460 look bad, but then again it was consistently faster and did allow the system consume 20% less power. The MSI 1050 4GB OC features a heatsink with less surface area than my smartphone. Even though it is only tasked with keeping a 75W TDP rated GPU cool, it's still very small. Nevertheless, operating temperatures were kept in check and they never exceeded 72 degrees in our gaming tests. More importantly, it was barely audible and certainly couldn't be heard over existing case fans. When overclocked, temperatures only increased by a few degrees and the fan only spun up ever so slightly. Right, so for now we're considering this as more of a preview because the big 20 plus game performance breakdown is still to come. Soon we'll be comparing the 1050 2GB head to head against the RX 460 2GB, and then of course the 1050 Ti 4GB versus the RX 460 4GB, and I might even sneak in the RX 470 into that comparison because I think that makes sense as well. For now, let's take a look at the cost per frame data based on the small sample of games just tested. Fully aware that some of these games didn't come out in AMD's favour, well in fact quite the opposite was true, this won't be our final conclusion. That said, the new RX 470, which we have priced at the $170 MSRP, comes out at a rather impressive $1.88 per frame, making it one of the better value options here. The GTX 1060 3GB also looks quite good as well. The GTX 1050 Ti is on par with the 3GB 1060, so that's good news, especially since it seems to have wiped the floor with AMD's RX 460 range, even with the updated price cuts taken into account. Worse still for AMD, the vanilla 1050 comes in at a much lower cost per frame, while delivering more frames overall. For those of you who don't find the scatter plot that easy to digest, we have hacked together a bar graph that tries to illustrate the situation in more simplified manner. This isn't really the correct way to show this data, but we are aware quite a few of you prefer this method. Anyway, you can plainly see that the RX 460 series costs more per frame while delivering less frames overall. As for MSI's cute little 1050 Ti OC graphics card, we rather like it. The fact that it can still be overclocked to squeeze out say 6 to 8% more performance without the need for an external power connector is just awesome. It also ran at very reasonable temperatures and generated very little noise. For those who are rocking older systems with slightly dodgy power supplies, this new graphics card might be the answer. Alright guys, that's all from me on this one. I hope you really enjoyed this review, and please be sure to keep an eye out for those upcoming head-to-head comparisons. They ought to be good.